So, Moon Rider here, and just wanted to throw something out there. I was riding in Long Island the other day, and I only got in about 20-some miles, but it was a nice ride, and it was perfectly safe, even though there was very little, if any, bike infrastructure. There were no bike lanes. There was no, nothing specifically bike here. But what there were fairly wide, well-maintained roads. Now, the roads were not ideal for cycling. They pretty much every road at some point seemed to turn into like a four-lane, mini highway. But it was perfectly safe. I never felt endangered. I had a good time. And then on the way back, I was a passenger in a car going through New York City to get home from Long Island. And we saw a lot of people on bikes, and I saw a lot of people also, driving, obviously, and walking. And what I noticed is that I paid attention to the cyclist, because, I'm a cyclist myself. Excuse me. I didn't see any particular egregious examples of cyclists doing anything wrong, right? And I've noticed this, when I go through New York City. Occasionally there'll be, one or two asinine cyclists, but generally speaking, most of the riders, just like most riders anywhere, are safe. And it is kind of funny because, and I don't mean funny in a ha-ha sense, like, oh, that was hilarious, but funny in terms of odd, right? Funny in terms of something funny here. It seems that the general trend in New York is when there's a problem, let's say with safety on the roads involving cyclists. Let's say a cyclist is injured or killed. The trend tends to be to blame the cyclist, right? And in particular, you have editorials denouncing cyclists, saying they're a menace and blah blah blah. And, but there's not a large problem with cyclists going around crashing into other people. There is a large problem with other people going around crashing into cyclists, right? We see pedestrians who are careless. They've all got one of those blue teeth or iPhone things attached to their face, like it's some kind of parasitic species, like the Borg from Star Trek. I think these things are just frankly addictive. But we for whatever reason, we see people, either they've made a conscious decision to endanger their safety and that of others around them, or they're so clueless. I don't know, but you see people marching across the street without looking. Some of them are on cell phones, some of them aren't, but a lot of them have these things in their hands or attached to their heads. And you see the people driving, they're cutting people off. They don't use turn signals. All sorts of stuff. And then you look at the cyclists and you're like, they're not doing anything really wrong. Certainly not, compared to the pedestrians or the drivers. And I think one of the things that a lot of people get wrong when they look at cyclist conduct is they assume anything that strikes them as odd must be unsafe. What they're not realizing is that virtually all of it's going to strike them as odd if they're not a cyclist themselves. So, let's say a cyclist riding alongside cars. Well, you're allowed to share a lane, right? But a driver might look at that, oh, he's going between the cars. That's, well, actually, the vehicle code explicitly states that you're allowed to do that. When it talks about, passing on it says moving left to pass, but then when it talks about riding to the right, it also says, quote, exercising due care while passing a standing vehicle or one proceeding in the same direction. So, if you just don't understand that, if you don't, you're not a cyclist. You've never thought about it. You've never conceptualized it. You're reacting purely at a perceptual level. You see something and you're like, oh my God, that's weird, and I don't understand it, so it must be dangerous. They must be doing something wrong. I think that's where a lot of this comes from, right? There are genuinely careless cyclists out there. I've seen them. Everybody's seen them. But the thing is, if you look at the bulk of avid riders, the vast majority of us know what we're safe, and we don't want to get involved in a collision, right? Because we know that, one, no matter what happens, there's always a possibility that we're going to get hurt, right? If we're hit directly or caused to hit something else directly by being run off the road, so if a pedestrian or a car collides with us, we're going to be injured. If we try to dodge the pedestrian or the car, we could still fall, or we could, be forced to crash into something else. I mean, if I'm run off the road, for example, I might hit a post, right? So, you know, and then no matter what kind of collision you have, because you're on a two-wheeled vehicle, and the same applies to motorcycles, you always have a secondary collision with the ground, right? So if I hit a car, or I get hit by a car, I'm going to hit the ground also. So, you know, it's two collisions really, not one. And then when you're on the ground, there's a possibility of a third collision. You get run over by somebody else. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes does. So as cyclists, we know all this and we tend to be careful. We also know that there's a general problem in the culture with people not realizing we're there and not looking for us. And we also know that because of all of this, that if something does happen, chances are that we're going to be the person that's blamed, that we're going to be the person who gets grief, and that you know, if it comes to, you know, pressing charges against the other party, or you know, suing for damages, you know, good luck, right? Good luck. Now, that's not to say that it's unsafe to ride, or that, you know, it's you know, you're risking your life when you ride. Most bike rides end safely, but the point is there is a widespread problem with people being unsafe around cyclists, both drivers and pedestrians. Is there a widespread problem with cyclists being unsafe? No. Are there occasional cyclists who are unsafe? Yes. But there's not a widespread problem, and more importantly, there's not a cultural problem where cyclists don't acknowledge that drivers and pedestrians are going to be there or even look for them. There is a problem with drivers and pedestrians not even culturally understanding that cyclists are part of the traffic dynamic and looking for them. And one of the things that I've noticed is that places that have attempted to make inroads in cycling-specific infrastructure, like New York City, for example, where they put bike lanes, they've done this, they've done that. Yes, they may make a handful of improvements here or there on this street or that street, but by and large, overall, what seems to be lacking is enforcement of the rules against dangerous conduct behind the wheel or by people on foot, or, to be fair, by the occasional reckless cyclist. It seems almost as if they're operating by the principle out of sight, out of mind, where, oh, we built a bike lane over there, so we don't have to worry about the people on all these other streets who are breaking the law and endangering cyclists. And that's, I'm sorry, that's not how reality works, right? If there's a widespread problem, making a small change to infrastructure in one specific spot isn't going to change the widespread problem. Because the widespread problem isn't that there wasn't a bike lane on that particular street. The widespread problem is that people's mentality needs to change. People need to be educated about safe road use. And there needs to be strict penalties if you kill somebody with a car, because you would be, unsafe or breaking the law. And similarly with people on foot, right? If you throw yourself into traffic and you cause an accident, there needs to be some consequence to that. Now, there's going to be a physical consequence if you're on foot. Unlike a driver, you're probably going to get injured in some way if you do cause an accident. But the point is that very often there's no legal penalty, and there doesn't seem to be a cultural penalty. There doesn't seem to be people taking up a hue and cry that this is a problem that needs to be addressed. In fact, generally speaking, if you have a pedestrian that causes an accident for a bicyclist, expect the bicyclist to be blamed, despite the fact that he was actually the casualty of the other person's careless conduct. We saw this. There was an incident in Central Park some years ago where a cyclist was minding his own business, riding down the road. Pedestrian stepped in front of him, no idea why. They were both injured. The pedestrian later died from her injuries. And did this prompt a re-examination of the attention of road users, of their awareness of their surroundings, of the need to recognize that bicycles are part of traffic and you should look for them for your own safety and that of other people, including the safety of the bicyclists? No. Actually, it prompted a widespread denunciation of reckless cyclists, which was particularly strange because there were no reckless cyclists involved in that incident. This actually mirrors something that happened in Boston many, many years ago called the Gladstone Spring Incident, which took its name from the two parties involved, Mr. Gladstone and Mr. Spring. And what happened was the cyclist was minding his own business, riding down the street, obeying all the laws. A pedestrian ran to cross the light, found that it had changed, jumped out in the street anyway, didn't look. In particular, didn't look for bikes. I mean, he managed to avoid stepping in front of an automobile, but he stepped in front of the cyclist and they collided, and the cyclist was injured and the pedestrian was injured. But the cyclist had the presence of mind to get on his radio. He was a licensed bicycle courier, to call for help and try to enlist passersby in administering first aid to the pedestrian who injured him and damaged his property. The problem is that passersby were more interested in placing blame, asking him things like, "Are you a courier and how fast were you going?" And it was downhill from there. The Boston, it was the Globe, began a smear campaign against cyclists, and it was kind of funny when they couldn't find examples of cyclists doing anything particularly dangerous. They ran articles quoting people who said that cyclists gave them dirty looks. I mean, this was how desperate they were to try and blame us for this sort of thing. And you know, it is interesting, right? I understand if you tell everybody that a particular group of people is the source of all the evil in the world, or at least in that particular context, the source of all the evil on, let's say, the roadways. And you say it enough, right? Their first reaction is going to be to blame those people. But who does this help? It obviously doesn't help the cyclists who are, you know, become blamed for things that they are not necessarily responsible for. But more importantly, it doesn't help all the rest of us, whether we bicycle or not. It doesn't help improve road safety. Because at the end of the day, the problem of people being careless, stepping into the street without looking for traffic, the problem of people who are breaking the law behind the wheel, all of these things that endanger cyclists are also a safety concern for everyone else as well. And, you know, in an attempt to try and avoid having to acknowledge that the cyclist might have a point about some of these things that people are doing that are asinine, illegal, and unsafe, what we're also not doing is solving the problem for everyone else as well. And maybe that's the way to get people to realize that they need to address this. Because if you just put it in terms of, well, this is a problem for cyclists, people who aren't cyclists a lot of times, because of this sort of cultural framework, have a negative view of cyclists. So they're not going to be all that, it's a problem for cyclists, who cares? Is basically going to be their take on it. But if you're, well, this is a problem for everybody, it just happens that the cyclists are the ones talking about it, maybe that's going to be how we get some of this stuff addressed, right? And at the end of the day, maybe we should also think this. We should think, you know, the roads are a constant changing dynamic of variables that are moving in all different ways and this and that. And maybe when you enter traffic, you should use your best judgment and exercise the amount of care and responsibility and awareness of your surroundings that your safety and the safety of everyone else around you is worth. If you don't care about killing yourself, what about all the other people around you? I'll leave it at that, but it is worth noting that as a cyclist, yeah, I was looking at the traffic patterns as we were going through New York, and I think, you know, people are always talking about how these cyclists are awful and blah, 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 but, you know, I see the car blocking the box, I see the guy not using a turn signal, I see the dude driving his car with no lights on, even though it's dark. I see the guy taking up 2 lanes, the dude running the stop sign.